Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another video in my history series, where today I'm going to be talking about the Great Fire of London, as I mentioned at the end of my plague video, which was the last video in this history series. For me, this is a historical event that I've always grown up knowing about. It's something I was taught about in school from an early age, and it's only when I mentioned it in a video quite a few months ago and a lot of my international viewers had no idea what I was talking about, did I realise that it makes sense it's only really taught and known about in the UK. It's one of the most well-known disasters in London's history, and I can always remember the year it happened, 1666, because 666, the year of the devil, and that's what a lot of people thought about it at the time. So in 1666, the year after the Great Plague took hold, a huge fire swept through London, destroying the majority of the city. People who had managed to survive the plague the year before thought their life was now just going to continue as normal, but of course, it wasn't. Now, before I continue, I just want to take a moment to thank Magellan TV for sponsoring this week's video. Magellan TV is a documentary streaming site full to the brim with premium, in-depth documentaries about a huge range of different topics. I'm the kind of person who watches documentaries constantly anyway, so a whole streaming service dedicated to them is right up my street, and I'm sure if you watch and enjoy my videos, it's probably right up your street too. Magellan TV have everything from true crime to history to science to nature and a little bit of everything in between. New programmes are added weekly, and Magellan TV can be watched anytime, anywhere on your TV, laptop or mobile. It's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Google Play and iOS, and there's no ads. And a load of the programmes are actually available in 4K, which is always a great little perk. There's actually a brilliant 3-part documentary on the Great Fire of London that I watched to research for this week's video. And just last night I got myself comfy in front of a Charles Manson documentary, and I do have my eye on one about the Romanovs too. Maybe a sneak peek at some future video topics, maybe, we'll see. If you want to check out Magellan TV, the first 100 visitors to magellantv.com/GeorgiaMarie will get a 1-month free trial. I'll leave the link in the first line of the description box down below if you want to go check it out. I would highly recommend that you do. And now let's get on with the video. So there are actually a lot of conspiracies about how the fire started. A lot of people don't really accept the official version of events, but this channel isn't a conspiracy channel, so I'm just going to talk to you about the proper, official, accepted version of events. Save your conspiracies for another time, maybe another channel. The Great Fire of London started around 1 AM on Sunday the 2nd of September 1666 in a man called Thomas Farriner's bakery on the aptly named Pudding Lane. At the back of the bakery was the bakehouse, which is actually what would now be on Monument Street today, but Monument Street didn't exist in the 1600s. Monument Street is so named because of the huge monument to the Great Fire of London that stands there. There's actually a really funny story about how one time my nan and granddad took me and my sister to London. They would take us to London like a couple of times a year to learn about the history and go to see West End shows and go to see the museums, and honestly it's some of my favourite childhood memories. And one year they took us to learn about the Great Fire of London, and we go to Monument Street to look at the monument and sort of sit underneath it and eat our packed lunches, and we couldn't find anywhere this massive monument. It had just gone and we were baffled. Anyway, turns out it was under construction and it was just covered in scaffolding, so we couldn't see it. So we sat at the bottom of the scaffolding and ate our packed lunches. And to this day, I've still never seen the monument to the Great Fire of London. Maybe I need to make that my mission next time I go into the city. Now, of course, back in the 1600s, ovens weren't as we know them today. They'd perhaps be more similar to what we know today as Peeps ovens, the stone ovens with the open front. Obviously not exactly, but that's kind of the closest way I can think of to describe them. The fires in the ovens were fuelled by bundles of brushwoods called a bavin, and at the end of the day, care had to be taken to ensure that the fire was completely out. Now, Thomas Farriner would later go on to insist that the fire was completely extinguished that night, and that his daughter had been downstairs at around midnight and she saw no signs of the fire still being lit. But by 1 a.m, Thomas's teenage son woke up, realising that the entire ground floor was on fire. He woke up his entire family who were sleeping on the second floor, and they all had to climb out of a window onto a neighbour's roof. Nowadays, it's believed that the fire was started when a stray ember ignited a bunch of brushwood that sat nearby to the oven. Within minutes, the fire had engulfed the entire bakery, moving on to neighbours' houses. To get a full understanding of why this fire was so dangerous, you have to have an understanding of what the streets of London looked like in the 1600s, something I also spoke about in my plague video. London was a crowded city with people living in very small, confined housing. The population of London had decreased dramatically in the previous year due to the plague, but of course the housing still stood. The streets were narrow and most of the houses were timber framed, built with wood and thatched roofs. The houses were built with a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle was basically woven wood and the daub was a mud mixture used to fill it in. So the walls were basically wood in the centre with mud to keep it all together. It was the cheapest way to build houses. Only the rich had fancy stone houses. The houses were mostly terraced tenement buildings with many stories, sometimes 6 or 7 different stories. And they had jetties, which basically meant that the upper floors projected out over the lower ones. By the time you reached the top floor of a building, you could just reach out the window and shake hands with a person in the opposite building. They were so close. When it came to the plague the year beforehand, this spelled disaster because it meant that there was no sunlight on the streets. It was just dark and dank. When it came to the fire, this meant disaster because all the buildings were so close together. The fire could move really quickly. And it didn't help that on the night of the 2nd of September, the winds were strong as well. The fire soon spreads to the neighbours, who also have to escape their houses quickly. The church bells rung about 2 a.m, so about an hour after the fire started, to alarm people to the fire. But in the 17th century, there was no police or fire brigade to call, so Londoners themselves were responsible for fighting the fire, helped by the local military. Firefighting equipment was stored in local churches and the public were expected to just use buckets of water and water squirts, which were basically something like a big syringe, a poor attempt at today's hoses. And that's all they had to fight these fires. And there were a lot of fires in London at the time. Fires broke out all of the time. Health and safety isn't like it was nowadays. Most of the time it could be contained pretty quickly. Occasionally it couldn't. By 3 a.m, the fire had spread across Pudding Lane and had burnt down many houses there, and it had moved on to neighbouring streets, causing the same destruction. This fire could have been contained and put out pretty quickly if it weren't for Lord Mayor Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Now, Thomas Bloodworth was woken in the middle of the night and told about the fire, and his only remark to this was reportedly, "Pish, a woman might piss it out," before going back to sleep. He didn't believe this fire needed his attention. But this city needed his permission to create fire breaks by pulling down houses using fire hooks, also found in local churches. Now, if Thomas Bloodworth had woken up, paid attention to the fire and had immediately given permission for these houses to be pulled down as fire breaks, there may have been a chance that this fire may not have spread at all and we'd never know of the Great Fire of London. But he didn't want to annoy people by pulling down their houses, and these people needed to support him if he was going to go on to do things as mayor. And so he refuses to give permission to pull down these houses. And so the fire continues to spread. It heads down towards the bank of the Thames, and so do the people. They're attempting to outrun the fire by running to the river. Wooden warehouses full of barrels of tar are on the bank of the river, and as the fire hits it, they explode, making the fire even worse. Also on the Thames was the London Bridge, the only physical connection at the time between the two banks of the river. And unlike London Bridge today, at the time the bridge was covered in housing, the same very flammable housing that was found across the rest of the city. By dawn, these houses on the bridge were also burning and the fire was spreading across the Thames. Samuel Pepys is a man who is most famous for his diary, which he kept for almost a decade during the 1600s, from 1660 to 1669. He wrote about everything going on in his life and in London is a hugely important source of information for historical events during this time. It's a first-hand witness writing down everything as he sees it. And of course he never planned for anyone to see his diaries, but they're some of the most important historical sources out there. His entries about the Great Fire of London are possibly his most famous diary entries. In the early hours of the 2nd of September 1666, Samuel is woken by his servant who had spotted a fire. Samuel looks out his window and decides that it's not a serious one before just heading back to bed. Like I said, there were a lot of fires that broke out in London at the time. Shortly after, he's woken by his servant once again, who this time reports over 300 houses have already been destroyed, and that London Bridge was about to go up in flames. And so Samuel Pepys heads out to the Tower of London to get a better view of the fire. He stands there for an hour just watching the flames. He writes, having stared in an hour's time seen the fire that rage every way, and nobody to my sight endeavouring to quench it, but to remove their goods and leave all to the fire, having seen it get as far as Steel Yard, and the wind mighty high and driving it into the city, and everything, after so long a drought, proving combustible, even the very stones of the churches. Of course that's kind of written in like older English, so I'll just round it up for you here. He's basically saying that he's watching the fire, he can see it raging in every direction because the winds are very, very strong and it's pushing it around. And nobody is doing anything to try and quench this fire. People are just desperately trying to save their possessions instead of doing anything to stop it. Everything's going up in flames, including the churches. There's been a drought, it's been a very long, hot summer, and so everything is just going up in flames. Samuel gets on a boat and he heads to see his good friend, the King, Charles II, and he actually becomes the first person to inform the King of the fire. He recommends to the King that homes be pulled down in the path of the fire in order to stem its progress. Charles tells him to go immediately to the mayor and tell him to start pulling down houses, and so Samuel Pepys rushes back to find the Lord Mayor. Of course, by this point it's daylight and the mayor is at a loss as to what he can do. He's reported as saying, "Lord, what can I do? I'm spent. People will not obey me. I've been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it." Which is obviously a huge 180 to his attitude just a few hours earlier when, pish, a woman could piss it out. He'd obviously woken up in the morning, realised how serious it was, and he'd started to pull down houses, but the wind and the flames were just so strong at this point that they were just jumping the gaps. Whilst the Great Fire of London raged, Pepys returned to his home. He writes of his feverish attempts to save his possessions. He scrambles in panic for his bottles of wine and his Parmesan cheese, which would have been a huge delicacy at the time, all of which he actually buried in his garden. He arranges the removal of most of his possessions, including his diary, which he actually sends out of the City of London to a friend in Bethnal Green. After a couple of days, he also sends his wife and all of his gold out of the city as well. By the Monday, people aren't trying to quench this fire, they're not trying to stop it, they're just escaping. It's already too strong to do anything about it. The smoke is so thick over the city that you can't see through it. People are no longer allowed into the city through the city walls, they're only allowed out. And by this point, important buildings are already destroyed by the fire, including the Royal Exchange, which was kind of the centre of the city's economy at the time. As well as being many other things, it was a huge marketplace. It was the main place people in the city went to buy their goods, and in minutes, sellers had their entire livelihoods destroyed. By the Tuesday, the King ordered for houses to be demolished using gunpowder, much more powerful, much quicker than pulling them down with fire hooks. And on the King's orders, no houses were to be spared. But by this point, it was too little too late. The fire was too strong. 100 homes were going up in flames every single hour. The flames are over 30 foot high and actually begins to escape the city walls. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, is still just a little bit rubbish at fighting the fire, so the King himself decides to take charge. The King takes to the streets to fight this fire. He sets up 8 fire posts across London, each staffed with 130 men. They're basically set up to fight the flames. He takes to the streets to inspire people to fight the fire, which is actually just an entire 180 from his actions the previous year during the plague, when him and his entire royal court escaped the city city at the first chance they could. Charles II did not have a good reputation as a king. He was known to be a party boy, a womanizer, and so this fire gave him a chance to prove himself, that he could be a leader, and he did prove himself. By the Tuesday night, St Paul's Cathedral, which was one of the greatest buildings in London and was thought to be a place of safety because of its thick stone walls, caught fire. Booksellers had actually stored all of their papers, all of their books in the crypt, thinking that it was an impregnable fortress that the fire couldn't get into. At the time, the cathedral was actually covered in wooden scaffolding due to repair works being done, and therefore it wasn't immune to the fire. The stone fell and soon the crypt caved in, destroying the livelihoods of so many more people in just an hour. Imagine how hot this fire has to be to bring down a 600-year-old thick stone building. People believed that the fire was an act of God and that they were being punished for their sins, and believed that this was symbolised in the burning of St Paul's Cathedral. However, by the Wednesday, the winds began to slow, and therefore so did the fire. The gunpowder-induced fire breaks were beginning to work, and so slowly the city managed to get the flames under control. By Thursday, the fire had all but died out. I'll put a map on the screen now showing London. The white shows the area of the city that's been burned out, and as you can see, it's pretty much the entire city, pretty much everything within the city walls. But the city's issues were just starting. Over 100,000 people had lost their homes, and London now had a vast homelessness situation to deal with. People had no shelter, no food, no water, and only the lucky few had managed to escape with some salvaged belongings. The rich had become the poor in just the space of a few hours. Entire livelihoods and grand homes and grand lifestyles had been destroyed. About a month after the fire, Charles II issued a proclamation asking all of the different counties across England to donate money to help the victims in London. But this had already kind of been done the previous years to help the victims of the plague, and therefore people didn't donate as much as you probably would like them to. But Charles also said that because this was an act of God, people were responsible for rebuilding their own homes from their own funds. The king didn't have to help them out, and of course insurance didn't exist in 1666. A special fire court was set up to deal with disputes between landlords and tenants to decide who should be paying for the rebuilding of these homes. The damage caused by the Great Fire was immense. 436 acres of London was destroyed, including 13,200 houses and 87 out of 109 churches in London. Some places still smouldered for months afterwards. The Great Fire of London caused the equivalent of what would be almost £2 billion of damage today. And of course, there had to be someone to blame for this. Somebody was responsible for the fire. But Thomas Fariner wasn't the person to be blamed. People blamed the foreigners. Over 300 years ago this happened, and this still sounds like something that would happen today. Many people are still in the mindset of, if in doubt, blame the immigrants. And that is exactly what happened. Back in the 1600s, suspicion was casted over the Dutch and the French particularly. There were literally mobs of people in the street beating up Dutch and French people because they blamed them, like that person specifically, for starting the fire. But the authorities, though, focused on a Frenchman called Robert Hubert, a 26-year-old watchmaker who was caught trying to escape the country as the fire blazed. Many people were trying to escape the country, but this particular man, Robert Hubert, was captured and questioned, and bizarrely, he actually confessed to starting the fire, something that we now know to be completely untrue. It was said that he maliciously started this fire by putting a fireball through the window of a bakery in Pudding Lane, Thomas Fariner's bakery. So don't get it wrong, the authorities knew exactly where this fire started, but for some reason Thomas Fariner potentially leaving some embers alight in his oven just didn't seem like a suitable explanation here. Sadly, Robert Hubert was actually just a bit mentally ill. He was mentally unstable, and he was most likely just wanting attention by saying that he started the fire, not fully understanding the gravity of what he was saying. Nowadays, he would most likely be found as unfit to stand trial, but in 1666, they didn't really have a concept of mental illness, and therefore it was only right that he went to trial. The city just wanted someone to blame. I don't think they really cared who it was, and the fact that it was a foreigner, well, all the better for them. At the trial, the entire Fariner family actually signed an indictment saying that they had nothing to do with the fire in the bakery and that it was all Robert's fault. They got away entirely scot-free with no blame whatsoever. I can only imagine their relief when Robert Huber actually confessed to starting the fire. But you do wonder if they felt any guilt whatsoever watching Robert walk to the gallows, because of course Robert Huber was hung for his crime at Tyburn Gallows on the 29th of October 1666. So what about the deaths caused by the Great Fire of London? It must be a huge number, right? Well, incredibly, the official death toll stands at just 6. One of these people was Thomas Fariner's own maid, and 2 were an old couple who died near the cathedral. St Paul's Cathedral, of course, was rebuilt after the fire. It was finished in 1711, and the building that we see today is now over 300 years old. But the previous building that was stood there before that was double that age, having been standing for over 600 years. It pains me to think of the history lost in the moment it burned down. If this fire could take down this 600-year-old stone-built building, how on earth did it only kill 6 people? But it turns out we're actually missing the bills of mortality for this time. The carnage in the city means that records just weren't kept for the time of the fire. I mentioned the bills in my last video on the plague. They were basically death records kept by the City of London, noting the cause of each and every death in each and every parish. But we don't have that for this week in September, and therefore we'll never know the numbers for certain. The accepted number of deaths is 6, which I do find hard to believe. I personally think there may have been many more people that died in the fire, but these people most likely would have been poor and homeless. Those warehouses, the big wooden warehouses that blew up on the Thames, well, they had many homeless people living in them at the time, and it's likely that they would have got out in time. And it's also unlikely that the authorities would have particularly cared about the poor dying, so why would it have been noted down? But it's also important to remember that the population of the city was actually a lot lower than it was the year before, thanks to the plague killing a huge amount of people off. So maybe there were just less people to die. There's actually a big misconception that the fire killed off the last of the plague, but that's not really the case. The plague was pretty much over by the time the fire started. Of course, London was rebuilt to the London that we know today, and it took almost 50 years to complete. It's not an easy feat to rebuild an entire city. The streets were designed to be wider with no more jetties overhanging. The jetties were made to be illegal, and there were better sewage systems, which I'm sure a lot of people were grateful for. Of course, it took a long time to clear all the rubble and plan new, safer street layouts, and the public buildings were paid for with money from a new countrywide coal tax. Houses now had to be built with brick rather than wood, and the job of rebuilding the city was given to none other than Sir Christopher Wren. He designed the new St Paul's Cathedral and the monument that stands today, as well as 52 of the other churches in the city. He is pretty much the man solely responsible for the city as we know it today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and as always, let me know down below what you want to see me cover next time, and of course go and check out Magellan TV in the first line of the description box down below, and let me know what you think of it. Let me know what documentaries you watch first. I need all of the recommendations. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.